Welcome to today's webinar hosted by Encore 360. We are absolutely thrilled today to have you all joining us as our audience filters into the Zoom room, so to speak, here. Today's webinar is, of course, titled Candid Content Marketing Tips, an exclusive interview with Joe Pulizzi. My name is Eric Sandy, and I'm the content director at Encore 360. And after years of listening to his weekly podcast, This Old Marketing, I'm very pleased to have my own chance to introduce Mr. Joe Pulizzi. He's an author, podcaster, marketing thought leader, and entrepreneur. And of course, you can hear him each week on This Old Marketing with his co-host, Robert Rose. And if you don't, you should. And today, Joe is here to talk about implementing a sound content marketing strategy for small businesses. Now, our own audience here at Encore 360 tilts heavily toward the horticulture market, but what we're talking about today is applicable to all lines of work. And I know we've got folks from all across the B2B and even the B2C spectrum here today. Before we begin with the interview, I've got a few of those typical webinar housekeeping notes up top. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see the Q&A button. You hit that and it'll open the Q&A box. Type in your questions as the conversation is going along. I will filter some into the interview as we're going, and at the end, we'll leave space to make sure we get to as many audience questions as possible. Also, just know that we are recording today's interview, and we'll be sending the archived video to all attendees via email in the coming days. I'll make a second note of that in the chat as well. I know that's a popular question. Lastly, if you enjoyed today's discussion, I recommend you sign up for Content Entrepreneur Expo. It's happening May 5th through the 7th in Cleveland, Ohio, where Joe will be speaking, and the Encore 360 team will be on site too. We're excited to learn about the cutting edge tools and trends driving the content marketing industry, and we can't wait to meet all of you there. With that, let's get into it. Joe, I figured maybe a good place to start might just be kind of a fun little question here. I'm curious, what was the last piece of content or the most recent piece of content that delighted you?
Well, first of all, Eric, thanks for having me. I engage with a lot of different pieces of content, and we have my podcast, This Old Marketing, to get ready for tomorrow as we record on Thursdays. But let's see, I'm reading an excellent book about Pete Rose right now called Charlie Hustle, that I'm really getting into a lot of backstory about him getting into gambling and his quest to be the all-time hit king. It's really interesting to me. But like from a helpful standpoint, my regular podcast listening, I listen to the Prof G podcast, Scott Galloway, every week, and also his Pivot podcast with Kara Swisher. So I love, from like a business standpoint, I love the guests that they bring to the table and they cover the news. But from like what I'm into right now, I'm digging this Charlie Hustle book, and I pick it up whenever I get a chance.
Love it. Yeah, certainly adding it to the list, especially we got baseball season underway here. Kind of the reason I asked that question, you hear advice from writers. They're always telling other writers to read as much as possible. Podcasters telling folks to listen to podcasts as much as possible. I wanted to lead with that question because we're going to be talking a lot today about output and creating content for a given audience. But I think just as important is our own personal content diet, so to speak. And so before we get into some of the more content marketing focused, strategy focused questions, could you maybe elaborate on that, on maybe the importance of thinking about that content as almost a two-way street as a consumer?
Well, I mean, first of all, if you want to be like the leading content expert for your audience that you're trying to target, you have to take in as much information as you can so you learn about their pain points and needs. Simply put, whether it's looking at what's going on in social and figure out what they're talking about, or reading the latest books or the trends or whatever. I mean, I give AI, for example. We'll probably talk about it later. I mean, I'm not all that into the AI movement. I've got a good friend of mine, Paul Reitzer, that's really into it, and he understands it. And I go to him for advice on what tools, whatever. But I know, as a marketer, as a content creator, I need to understand these things. So I'm reading I'm reading New York Times and Morning Brew every day. I'm listening to the podcasts that I just mentioned before. I read and or listen to at least 2 nonfiction books. Fiction books a month, as well as the nonfiction, because as a content creator, I get my best ideas when I'm actually engaging in fiction, which is strange. But I talk to a lot of creators that it seems to open up different neural pathways, if you will, getting into that. So where where you like, where do I find time for all this? I would just say I know a lot of professionals, small business owners, that maybe they're spending an hour or two extra on social that they know don't need to. Maybe get away from the TikTok scrolling or dead scrolling or whatever you want to call it. I would say take that time and invest it into long form written content, newsletters, books, audiobooks, something like that, and set a goal of one per month, two per month, whatever the case is, and then it'll become habit after a while.
Yeah, I know. I know the dietary food pyramid's kind of a controversial topic over the last X amount of years, but there's probably a comparison there
Probably.
to a
It's
balanced
good.
diet.
Good point. Yeah.
Um, so I guess in terms of having maybe a stage setting question here, I talk with a lot of business owners who are, I might call them content curious. They're interested in embarking on some sort of content marketing campaign. They're interested in investing in it, but they're also partly looking for a definition of content. So, as the author of several books on the subject, and you've been having these conversations for many years now, in a succinct way, maybe how would you define content in terms of content marketing?
Well, so first we should probably talk about how marketing has been done for the last 50, 60, 70 years. And most of that's through interruption. So in generally, before we got to this point of Google and social media and being able to create on all these devices, we were like, okay, well, where's our audience at? They're watching some show, they're reading some print magazine, they're going to some event, somebody else's, and then I am going to market around that and try to interrupt them. So let's just take a magazine, for example. Look at a magazine ad. What's the goal of a magazine ad? To disrupt, to interrupt their reading so that they look at that ad and that product and you can see some return on investment from that. So that's generally how we were in this age of interruption for 100+ years as these media channels arrived. Well, now we can be the media. So if you look at what content marketing is, they're like, okay, we want to create our own audience. We want to create valuable, relevant, compelling information on a consistent basis. That could look like a blog, a podcast, a YouTube channel, whatever the case is. We want to build an audience that comes to know, like, and trust us in some way because we're delivering this valuable information to them. And if we do that really well, over a long period of time, we should see some profitable action coming from them. Are they going to buy more from us? Maybe they're prospect and they become a customer in some way. Maybe they are they stay longer as customers. Whatever the case is, you're trying to create better customers from that. So that's the whole idea of it. Instead of interrupting, we're like, can we be the content information resource for them? Can we create the show, if you will? And that way, not that there's anything wrong with advertising. I'm a big proponent of advertising, that it's not one against the other, but most money is still spent on interruption. And we're trying to, like, if it was, let's say, we just had the eclipse and all. So like if all the money out there, advertising is like the sun and content marketing is like Pluto. It's not even a planet. We're trying to do
Yeah.
it all. We're just trying to figure out. So we're still really early days, if you will. And I think there's an opportunity to move some of that from interruption dollars into, hey, how do we create better customers? How do we become the leading expert in our thing? Let's figure out what our show is, what that looks like, and create an audience.
Yeah, I know. This may tie into one of the kind of recurring thesis statements almost that I know you've mentioned in the podcast frequently and in books, the idea of not building on rented land, so to speak. And oftentimes that's in the context of social media platforms or other things like that. What you're talking about in that last answer is essentially audience development and owned media, where you can have a conversation with those audiences before a purchase is made and certainly after a purchase is
That's right.
made. Could you maybe elaborate on that key idea of ownership in that
Sure.
calculation?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, when I first got into the content marketing industry, most of our products were either we would create a custom print magazine, so we would either have to get or we had the audience addresses so we could send them the print product, or it was an email newsletter where people had to opt in and we actually got the data, we got the email address, they had to check a box, and then we had control over the distribution. That has changed in the age of social media, where if you or I, I'll give personal example. So I did fairly well on Twitter throughout the years. I built an audience, not my audience, but an audience of over 150,000 followers on Twitter, now X. Over the last couple of years, the algorithm has changed so much where I used to have some significant following, and then it just sort of died off. And when I tweet something, and of course, maybe I didn't put enough effort into it, if you will, but that algorithm and those followers are not mine. I am renting, I'm leasing that space. Maybe I can get some benefits out of it, maybe not, but I don't have any of the data or any of the control of distribution to that group of people. That's the same with Facebook, with Instagram, with TikTok, with YouTube. We're just renting that space. And by the way, I got no problem with that. Those are private companies. They could do whatever they want. I don't care who buys it, who owns it, whatever. It's a free service for me to create content. Great. And by the way, for everyone on there, yeah, if there's an opportunity, we should look at that. And sometimes we get our start in content marketing on, like, say, creating a YouTube show. But at the end of the day, we've got to figure out how do we move those followers, those fans, those subscribers from platforms that we can't control to something we can control. And that's why we're so big on things like print magazines. That's why we're so big on things like email newsletters, because then at the end of the day, we have that one-to-one communication connection with them. So that's where it's just an interesting time right now, especially I would say 5 years ago, nobody was really talking about this. And now everybody is really clear that, hey, I had a buddy of mine last week that just got totally banned from YouTube for doing something that he didn't even know. And he had 100,000 followers on there and can't get his channel back. So that happens. We just should expect it. We should expect to get up every day and being thankful that we have these social media outlets, but at any point they could be taken away from us.
Yeah, it's important context, and again, another reason to, in embarking on the content marketing journey, another reason to stay up on the news around these platforms. And I think it can be an intimidating conversation too. And so I wanted to maybe continue to back up to the starting point, I suppose, of a content marketing investment. It can be intimidating and it can be tempting to want to blanket these platforms. And if you're going to make the hire or make the investment to get an account on X, to set up a YouTube channel, to begin the podcast next week, and then to launch your newsletter the week after that, that strikes me as a little bit of casting a very wide net, and I feel like you'd agree. So could you maybe talk through how to think about those first few weeks or months of this journey, so to speak?
Sure, absolutely. So I don't know where everyone's at right now. I'm assuming that everyone is doing something somewhere. So we're all dabblers, if not proficient in some of these areas. But generally, marketers do the opposite of what media companies have been doing. So what we want to do is we want to think like a media company. We want to focus on one platform, one content mission area, one tilt, if you will, differentiation area, and try to be the leading expert in that and do one thing really well. Is that a newspaper like the New York Times? Is it a blog like Huffington Post? Is it an event series like TEDx? Whatever. We focus on doing one thing well. And that's what media companies do. And then they diversify once they build an audience. What marketers generally do is they diversify immediately. They're like, okay, we got to do the blog, got to do the email newsletter. Let's do some research about this event series we'll do a webinar series. We got to be on X, Instagram, TikTok. We got to be everywhere our customers are at. And first of all, Eric, I apologize because back in my book, Get Content, Get Customers in 2008, 2009, I said, be everywhere your customers are at. But at that time, we only had like 10 places. Now we've got 1,000.
Yeah.
So you only have, I call it content energy. You as a small business owner, as a marketer within a small business, have limited content energy. Doesn't matter the resources of the budget. We can only do so much. So we want to start by doing one or two things really well. So first of all, who's your specific audience? If you're in B2B, for example, you might have 6 to 9 buyer personas. We only want to focus on one to start. And I know that's hard to do because we're like, oh, we want to talk to all our customers. Well, if as soon as you widen it out to all your customers and all your prospects, the mission is way too broad and you're not going to hit on anybody's pain points. So start small. So you say, what is that content mission? And then what do we got to do? Where's the show going to be at? Is it going to be a YouTube show? Is it going to be a podcast? Is it going to be a blog series? Is it going to be an email newsletter? Whatever it is, we're just going to do that. and start. Because by the way, when you get 6 months from starting it, it's going to change into something
Mhm.
else because we're going to learn, because we got to practice. We got to start somewhere. So instead of boiling the ocean and being mediocre doing all these things, and if you're a small business marketer getting fired after 18 months because you don't see any return, let's have the best email newsletter to this specific audience on this topic in the world. And for B2B, it's especially strong to do that. You can absolutely do it. And I know your CEO might say, "Well, I want to do all the things," and you have to fight that battle. You have to say yes, but we can't be great at that yet. We can't do that yet. We're going to do one thing at a time, and this is the thing we're launching now. And once we build an audience, then we can diversify into other areas. So I would start small, build that base, and then go from there.
I know you've got some thought exercises and tips, obviously, in your books, which I highly recommend because this can get kind of abstract very quickly. But what I wanted to ask was if you might have some tips for business teams that are trying to probe that differentiation point. And I think every business team is going to believe that it knows its differentiation point, and maybe they do. But a lot of times I encounter differentiation points that are still fairly broad. How might you suggest a team? And I know this could get into the weeds pretty quickly, I feel like,
Yep.
but how might you suggest a team ratchet that down and identify something that is specific and is a true tilt, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about the content tilt a lot. The content tilt is that differentiation area where you can break through all the clutter. And there's two things that most companies do really poorly. They don't deliver consistently and don't have a solid content tilt. So the first place you want to start with is, what are we talking about here? Like, what's the story? What informational problem are we going to solve for? And we want to start with the sweet spot. So first of all, who is your audience? What are their pain points? What keeps them up at night? And so on the one side, you want to list those. What are those things that, boy, we're getting all these customer questions. This is a whole new area in our industry that nobody's focusing on right now. So you list all those, and on the other side, you list all your expertise areas as a company. Like, what is it? Your people? Maybe it's your engineering staff. Your plant managers are amazing. You have knowledge in these areas. You've done some research. Like, you have a whole thing of uh, amazingly things that you've done in expertise over the years, and you take those side by side and you look for opportunities. You might look for a theme throughout, and so take a couple weeks with those because you don't know what the show is. I mean, you're not just a lot of times a content idea will happen where a senior executive will come down and say, "Hey, I saw so and so did a podcast. Why don't we do a podcast? Let's do it on this topic." And then you realize that, oh my God, there's already 100 shows out there on the same topic. And how are you going to differentiate and break through all that clutter? Well, you're probably not. So let's take a step back and figure out, keep moving back and looking at all those areas and say, okay, we're going to create a topic to this audience that maybe there's 3 or 4 or 5 people sort of covering that area, but you're going to do it in a different way. Maybe nobody's doing a podcast on it. Maybe nobody's doing a blog on it. Maybe nobody has an email newsletter, because there's a lot of email newsletters out there, but most of them are terrible. So let's focus. How do you break through all that spam? You create a newsletter that's really, really good. So that's what the things that I would focus on is write those down and figure that out. And then you take a lot of your own brand and your own personality as a company into that. Maybe you have somebody that's really good on air on your marketing team. Great. You could bring them. Maybe you know of a partner that can come to the table with something. Maybe they have some expertise in and podcasting of something. They're really good on the microphone, or they're a really good writer. That's when you start to figure out to say, okay, well, it makes more sense to do a podcast than a newsletter, than an event series, and whatever the case is. So start there, start simple, and try to get that audience down so far niched where you can say you can be the leading expert, because you can always go bigger later. You can't go
Mhm.
smaller. You can't go down. So start with the smallest niche audience, and then once you build that audience, you can go from there and broaden it out.
Yeah, I was speaking with a team at a business, and on their website they have essentially a form that where you can ask direct questions of the team and get an email back. But none of that had been public facing. It's all just these exchanges that have happened via email. And we were talking about the fact that right there is a wealth of not only story ideas but potential differentiating topics. And certainly some of the questions are very product specific or almost too granular, but a lot of them are it's essentially an echo chamber of what your audience is already looking for. And emailing them an answer is certainly fine. But opening that up for public consumption is possibly even better.
That's the lowest hanging fruit start, Eric. If
Yeah.
you were just saying it's and Marcus Sheridan talks about this. They says they ask, you answer. What are the biggest
Mhm.
questions that your audience is asking that has nothing to do with your product or service, but it revolves around what you do? So it's like, if you were a home contractor of some kind, you might talk about different energy solutions specific to your area that only you can cover in your certain way because you get certain weather patterns or whatever the case is. So there's specific to your audience, you can be that expert. So you might have that. That's the great part about setting up these, you know, informational listening posts, if you will, on social media and going to events and talking to your customers. If you have somebody that's taking this down or you've taken it down somewhere, if you've done research reports, you might have a lot of this information already outside of your product. It's like, wow, we know our customers better than anyone else. How do we get that information, package it up, and give it back to them as a gift in the form of a newsletter, a blog post, a YouTube series, whatever the case is?
Yeah, and I can almost hear some audience members, and if they're thinking this, please feel free to chime in the Q&A. But I can almost hear some audience members saying out loud, this is great, love the idea. This can also get very expensive and time consuming. And so, what's the ultimate why here? And so, I wanted to maybe briefly talk about goal setting in terms of going down a content marketing campaign. Two of the most prevalent goals that I feel like are shouted out are lead generation and increasing brand awareness. One of those is quantifiable, but can be difficult to pin down. The other is less quantifiable, but has its role as well. How do you recommend businesses think about goal setting? And as a subset of that question, are those two goals uh, specific enough?
Well, back to your point about we're running a business here.
Yeah.
So the why is very important. We probably jumped that step too quickly. So what's the business problem? Are we losing customers? Do we need to focus on loyalty? Uh, Maybe the problem is that our customers aren't spending enough. So we need to create better customers that spend more with us. So instead of, I mean, those are where I would like to start. I think most of us need to start because the hardest thing to do is to get a customer. If you already have customers, let's focus on those first and how to keep them. And that's where content marketing comes from. I mean, the custom magazine was all about loyalty driven events. If you look at Walmart, you look at Lego, you look at Target has one. I mean, they all have magazines that we know, the car magazines, that you've got airline magazines. They all started with loyalty. How do we keep those customers? So if you're going to do this, just focus on one goal. If it's lead generation, which is fine, but again, I mean, you said, not that I'm going to correct you, but I'll correct you a little bit, Eric. I never
Hmm.
say content marketing campaign because the reason
Hmm.
why we don't want to say campaign is a campaign always stops. If we think about a political campaign, thankfully, a
Yeah.
political campaign stops, right? We're all
Yes.
happy that a political campaign stops. And that's where a lot of businesses get it wrong because if we're starting a content marketing initiative, a newsletter, a YouTube series, a podcast. Think of those as sort of your major ones. You don't stop. This is not something where you get to episode 10, you're like, I'm done. Let's go do something else. But that's what a lot of companies do. So you do not want to stop it. We'll change it. We'll iterate it. We might change the schedule a little bit, but we never want to stop. Like this old marketing podcast, we're in episode 421 or something. We've been doing this since 2013. So you continue, and every week we've done that. We've showed up or whatever, and that's what we have to do as well. And you don't want to stop because once you stop, you lose that trust. Whatever you built, it's gone. They're going to go somewhere else to get it. So I would just start by thinking that way instead of the campaign mentality. I think that's very helpful. So whatever you start, focus on one goal and doing one thing well. And I would say if you can focus on the loyalty goal, if that's a problem for you, that's where you can say, okay, we can send something specifically to our customers. And this is stuff that you can measure, by the way, because let's say that you start an email newsletter and the whole goal is like you want to keep customers loyal or you want to generate more yield off your current customers. Well, you can start to measure that. You know who's subscribed to your email newsletter. You know the new people coming in as well, because those could be leads for you that sign up. The current customers that are on there, you can say, oh, they've been getting this email newsletter for 9 months. What's their buying behavior? These are
Yeah.
things you can absolutely measure today. The thing is that I wouldn't expect anything in less than 6 months. Like if you're saying, Joe, I like this content marketing thing. What can I expect in 6 months? I would say nothing. Like it takes a long time to build a relationship with an audience member with content. Media companies, that's why media companies have 3-year plans, because it takes a long time to build an audience. So I'm not saying you have to be 3 years, but I'm saying go into it with patience and lower expectations. So set out to 12 to 18 months and say, yes, in 12 to 18 months, if we deliver consistently over this period of time, we should start to see some changes on they're buying more, they're staying longer. Some of these names that have signed up for this have become customers, and you can go back and say, great, look at this ROI, it's worth it. But again, all we're talking about right now is one thing. We might promote it a lot of different ways, but we're doing one show, whatever that show might be, so we can be the best in that one thing.
Yeah, maybe to drill down a little bit, we've talked about podcasts and newsletters. Those are two things that have been mentioned a few times. So maybe a business decides to start a newsletter. That's what they're going to focus on. And the main metric is simply growing subscribers and possibly increasing that open rate or
Mm-hmm.
keeping it above a certain level, let's say. Um, Obviously, a consistent delivery is an important part of that. Maybe it's every Tuesday, maybe it's the first of every month, whatever it might be. But I wanted to ask, and again, this could also be the subject of a whole other hour-long webinar. Um, what are some ways that businesses should, I guess, get that out the door? Meaning, you want to build a team that creates this, but how should businesses think about what's going in there? And the reason I
Sure.
ask is I see a lot of B2B facing newsletters that are very close to traditional advertising in some ways, or they're shouting out specific products
Yep.
rather than getting into engaging content, so to speak. So how would you recommend teams think about what goes in this newsletter each week?
Yeah, again, you have to think about it like it's a product. This is not
Yeah.
just an offhand marketing thing that we're trying out, they're testing. You need to really put some time and effort into it. So I would make sure that you set aside enough resources to be as good as you possibly can with the resources you have. So let's say that somebody says we should do a newsletter 2 times a week. Well, do you have the resources to do it 2 times a week? And again, bring up this really good point. A lot of newsletters that are out there, especially in B2B, are product focused sales newsletters. That's not what we're talking about. We're
Right.
talking, by the way, you might, in an educational newsletter to your customers, you might put hey, come see us at this show, or hey, here's our new product, but you do that outside of the content itself. You set it up like your own little advertisement within your newsletter. You keep the educational content separately. Be great at those things. And that, by the way, that's tough for a lot of small B2B companies, because they're like, hey, we're not talking about our products and services enough. I said, yeah, that's the whole point. I mean,
Yeah.
just think about how we all want to be marketed to. Like, we want to do business with people that are helping us live better lives or get better jobs. That's the kind of thing that we have to send out on a regular basis. So let's say we're talking about a newsletter. You talked about whether you want to do a content audit first and figure out all the different places that you already have content, but you probably need some contributors. Those could be some of your employees. You need somebody leading this effort, some project manager to do the whole newsletter to make sure it gets out there. A great little tactic is let's say you have a lot of employees that have a lot of knowledge around this newsletter that you want to get out to your audience. Well, maybe they're not great writers. Maybe they're not great speakers. So get somebody in your organization, some content editor that can extract that information from them. Maybe it's, hey, here's 5 questions in an email. Respond back to me. I'll put it in an article for you. Those types of things make it easy. If you want to do a letter from the CEO in your newsletter every 2 weeks, well, don't expect the CEO to write that. Expect to see you go in and do, hey, we dictate a 20-minute meeting talking about whatever the key issue is, and then somebody else can write that up. It's just like you would at any other project. Outsource, find the experts that can do this thing and get it going. So then that's why there's a lot just to go on with this one thing, and that's why we don't want to do too many things. So I would just focus on those small things. And if let's say an e-newsletter, like, I'm not a fan of monthly newsletters because I think so much time goes by that they'll think it's spam. So I think every other week is probably the minimum.
Mhm.
Weekly is the perfect amount, in my opinion, that you could do it. Again, it's not salesy. These are really educational, and it shouldn't sniff of sales. It should really be, wow, this company is giving away this information. I really start to trust them. And when they think of buying something, they'll think of buying from you because they lean on you every day for really good information.
Yeah, and I think just a quick thought on that with the cadence. You don't want your audience to forget about that newsletter if it's coming
No.
out every 60 days or whatever the case
If
might
they
be.
can't remember signing up for it, you're not sending you're not
Yeah,
sending it. Like, where's this come from? This is spam. You're spamming me. It's like, oh, you signed up for it. Well, you're only sending it every month.
yeah.
So there you go.
One question I wanted to ask, and I think I'm going to rephrase it as I'm asking, but the starting point of this question was going to be, Epic Content Marketing. The first edition of that book that you wrote came out about 10 years ago. And so one question was going to be kind of, what might 2013 Joe think of the media market these days, or where the content marketing industry has grown to? So that's one way of
Sure.
asking this question. Another way of asking it might be, um, what is going on in the broader news media and advertising ecosystem that makes this conversation so important in 2024, or these investments so important in 2024? Now that's a mouthful, but I think it might be helpful. Most of us at least are based in communities that have either lost newspapers or
Yep.
magazine subscriptions are disappearing, folios are getting much thinner. I think there's a basic economic reality in the media ecosystem,
Mm-hmm.
which is a tough pill to swallow, but it's also an opportunity for businesses to make an investment like what we're talking about. What do you make of that, I guess, as we get into 2024 here?
Well, if you go back to the way that it was originally done, why did everybody buy television advertising in the 70s? Like, why did P&G just dominate without because they could reach everybody they needed to reach?
Yeah.
Done. There was no reason for them to do anything else but buy television advertising. And then we got into the early 2000s and 2010 and on, and now we're looking at, oh man, it's harder to advertise effectively because to do so, I think I've got to advertise at 17 different places because my audience is all over the place. And then you're at the same time, you're like, wow, everyone can create their own media channel. All I need is this little gadget here, my little phone here that I can do. I can have my own media company. I can create my own little marketing division with almost no technology today. Is it all does it for itself? So I'm thinking, so what is the most effective way to regularly communicate with your audience today? Or do you need to rely on other channels? It's dicey. It's possible. I think Eric, you and I could sit down and say, all right, we're trying to target this person. We can advertise all these different ways. We could do these shows. We could do some PR. We could do a lot of traditional things, but very, very difficult to do. I would rather be in more control of the marketing business model behind this and say, okay, even with all this competition, how do we find an area that we can stand out and focus and build an audience somewhere? So that's now when I see in 2013, when we first wrote Epic Content Marketing, nobody was really doing this effectively. Now they might be doing it effectively, but almost every company is creating a significant amount of content. Companies are creating more content than anything else they do. Either products or services, accounting, anything. We're creating so much content, it's crazy. So people are overwhelmed and they're making specific choices on which content to engage in. If we're not part of that content conversation somewhere, you get shut out of ultimately of the decision making process for whatever industry you're in. How do you not get shut out? Well, I guess I'm going to have to stop talking about my product so much. And I'm going to have to figure out something where I can give information to them for free. And hopefully in return, if I do that well, I'll get some more business from it. I think that's the best way to go. The big ongoing challenge is I can't make that happen overnight. That is a
Mhm.
long process that takes even I'm in the content creator space and work with these content entrepreneurs. Even content entrepreneurs, this is all they're doing every day. It takes them 18 months just to get to a point where they feel like they're making enough money. And that's all they're doing. So we're small businesses. We're running all kinds of stuff. At the end of the day, how long is it going to take us? So we have to be really patient and really focused. if we're going to do this thing.
Yeah. I didn't want to get into any major AI tangent here, but there might be an interesting segue here. Recent podcast episode, you guys were talking about getting your content house in order. And again, this can get fairly into the weeds here, but user search habits are changing. The internet's only becoming more embedded in our lives and in our purchasing habits and our interactions with brands and other people. Um, what are the, I guess, opportunity costs of not investing in content marketing? And put another way, why is it so important to have a healthy digital footprint as we continue moving along here?
Such a great question, and it's actually a scary question for me because, as you know, we've been talking about this on the podcast a lot. As these AI language models are going and getting all this training data, they're basically taking all this content from all over the place. And that ultimately will be our truth. Just like Google is our truth today for a lot of people. That we know that's sort of flipped, where you got half of the people now that are going to ChatGPT and other AI services to ask questions, and you've got the other half going to search engines. Well, if you're a company and you're not in those, where are you? How do people find you? So you've got Google that have really become the first 4 or 5 results have become sponsored. I can still do paid search, so I can still be sort of found there. With AI, you can't. You can't pay right now. I don't know if that's going to be a thing. They're just taking all this content, whatever they believe is true, and we know that there's mistakes there, but that goes up there. So if you don't have, let's say you have no blogs that position you as an expert in your stuff. You haven't been doing any podcasts. You haven't been doing any newsletters. There's nothing out there on the web. You just have your product stuff and you're doing advertising, but there's nothing that says this is what you are, what you stand for, your content mission, your editorial plan, those things. I'm afraid that as everybody moves to whatever this AI search, whatever this truth is going to be, you might be left out. No, this is not happening tomorrow, but it's happening soon.
Mm-hmm.
So I was surprised. I think you probably heard me talk about on the podcast. I went to a social media event and the host got up and said, "How many of you are using on a daily basis ChatGPT for all your search queries and you moved away from Google?" And half of the people raised their hands, and I was blown away. I'm like, "Are you kidding me? It's wrong. It's not. They're pulling information from the internet, and the internet is wrong in a lot of cases."
Yeah.
And that's a concerning. So there's no moderator there. So again, I'm not talking about the end of the world here, but I am talking about that we've got a couple of years here where I think we've got to make sure that you're known for something. Like, what do you want to be known for? What do you want to be the leading expert in outside of the products and services you offer? What do you want to be known for? I think we've got a short period of time that we have to start taking it seriously, where every one of us, like it or not, we have to be media companies and be innovative. And so let's say that you don't believe anything I'm saying. You're like, put it to the side, whatever. I'm sure that you can still advertise in certain locations and still interrupt and still gain following. But I think it's going to be more difficult. And I don't think the fastest growing, most innovative companies are doing that. I think what they're doing is they're figuring out a way, like Red Bull Media House, like Lego, like Microsoft. They've already figured out a way, like, oh, we have our audience. We know our audience. We've created all these amazing Lego, for example, I subscribed to their Brick Kicks magazine in 1987. It's now called Lego Life magazine. They still produce it today. I mean, it's so 40 years later, they're still producing this magazine and it's still working well. I don't think a lot of people realize the investment patience it takes, but it's worked really, really well for Lego.
Yeah, I think I definitely want to circle back to that. We've mentioned print products in passing, and I think that might be maybe a surprising topic for the audience, but I definitely want to get back to that in a moment. We had an audience question here that I think kind of dovetails with the last couple questions that we ran through. This audience member is asking about kind of that balance between educating and entertaining your audience. And we've talked a lot about educating, and we've talked a lot about entertaining as well, but how to strike that balance. And this person is suggesting that, a lot of team members, especially in kind of B2B environments, want to get very technical and specific and granular with the information that they're sharing, whatever the topic might be. But of course, there's also value in maybe zooming out a little bit, and appealing to perhaps a broader audience, and certainly even having fun with it, not getting lost in the technical weeds,
Sure.
so to speak. But of course, a lot of these businesses are technical just on face value. So how do you recommend folks think about striking that balance?
Well, I think kind of two different questions in there. If we talk about entertaining and educational, I think that you're talking about the same thing. Like educational doesn't mean boring. Educational
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean technical. But basically, what we want to send out is something that's going to keep their attention. I brought the Charlie Hustle, Pete Rose book. I mean, that's just chock full of interesting, funny, memorable stories, but all the way I'm being informed. I'm being educated about the process and what happens. So we need to do the same thing. There's a roofer out in Orange County, California, that every day um, gives the weather. This is the weather. You could be very technical about the weather. You could be very informative. You could be very boring if you wanted to and say it's going to be 75 and sunny and overcast. Well, this gentleman gets up, this rougher, which became one of the best known roofers because of every day would get up and just say very folksy. Like if you can feel the wind coming up the southeast, it's going to be one of those kind of days and goes through, and this is going to be the temperature. And people rely on him for the weather. Very informative, very not too technical, whatever. I think you could do both. And by the way, I've seen some very like you and I've talked about before, Indian manufacturing out of New York. They talk about industrial soldering equipment. Very, very technical topics. Doesn't have to be boring. You can be interesting when you do that on a regular basis. So I would just say, what's your brand? You do this at the beginning. What's your brand? What do you stand for? What kind of content are we going to create? Are we going to be funny? Are we going to be sarcastic? What's our personality of the show, if you will? Think about those things ahead of time. And I think you're seeing more dividends today for, I hate the word authentic, but I'm going to use it, truly authentic, very transparent, very funny, very tongue-in-cheek, like very like even outward, even more than you would think. Just don't talk like a boring business to business company. And another thing is when you talk about newsletters or shows, it's not coming from the company. It's coming from an individual within the company, which is really important because
Mm-hmm.
people want to buy from other people. So lift up your employees, lift up your hosts, whatever, and have that newsletter come from like, my newsletter comes from Joe Pulizzi. They know it's coming from me. I've seen it. I've read it. I've had lots of other people help me and work on it, but it's coming from me. They can respond directly to me. They know my
Yeah,
sense of humor. You should have that going on in your organization as well, and lean into those people who are weird and different because that
yeah.
generally means you'll get an audience from it.
I just want to say I love the weather report example. I think that's absolutely fantastic. It just reminds me too that not that it's the same thing at all, but for a little while there, David Lynch was providing weather reports on social media and providing his own little twist to that. That. To your point, though, it's a simple, consistent touch point with an audience. It's meaningful information. They can get it from other places, but this is a much more
And
authentic
relevant
delivery
and relevant to the industry. I
and
mean,
relevant to
roofer,
roofing. Yeah,
it's so a little bit relevant, but outside. So again, you don't have to do something that's definitely exactly in your area. You could broaden it out a little bit from the content standpoint, but focus it on the particular audience needs. I think you'll hit a home run.
yeah. I think that last point about uh, having this content coming from a person rather than just a brand is a point very well made, and it's something I've noticed over the last X amount of years in news media publishing, and I think it's very relevant here. Two pushbacks or two, I guess maybe arguments that I'd love to get your take on.
Sure.
One is a concern about employee turnover and investing in a name that who knows how long they'll be with the company. That's one. And then the other one being, well, why don't we make it the CEO's name or some other executive level name? But they're a little gun shy on doing that and being in front of the camera, so to speak. So for a company that maybe in general hasn't been in front of the camera like that or had a byline, um, we're obviously it's important to have this content coming from a person. How might you recommend they think about that?
So the truth is you might lose that person.
Mm-hmm.
So weigh your risks.
Yeah.
I mean, IBM years ago made the decision that they were going to allow their employees to be very, very active on social media. They put the little caveat where it's personal, this might be a personal opinion and not that one of IBM, but they let them go to town, and IBM quickly became the leader in social media in the tech space until they changed that policy, and they got nervous about turnover. So, what do you got? What do you got? Yes, somebody might. You're going to help that person become like an influencer in the industry. I think they're going to stick around. You're going to give them
Mhm.
resources to create content and to build an audience. This is fantastic. Are people going to leave? Well, yeah, maybe. But I think that that's an opportunity. I think you see more. I think if there's going to be a trend here with B2B companies specifically, you're going to see more instead of, hey, our company content marketing effort is going to launch these three things. I think you're going to see them invest in individual creators in their companies, employees, and say, okay, we've got this employee that's doing amazing on Instagram. Let's put resources behind that. We got this employee that's doing amazing things on TikTok. Let's put resources behind. Let's promote this. Let's get them what they
Yeah.
need. How do they create more content? How can we promote that content? That will be really effective. I think that's going to um, change everything that's going on in B2B. So you might want to think about that. What was the other question was
Executive level types who
uh,
might be gun shy or maybe unwilling in some cases to have their name attached.
it's in the past, I mean, I've been around it where, we want to put the CEO on the cover of the magazine, or we want to get the CEO column. And most of the time, it's just terrible. It just doesn't work out. It's not believable. A lot of people don't believe that the CEO actually thinks that, actually wrote that, whatever. Give Take some talent. You see, basically you got some minor league talent here.
Yeah.
Let's take them up to the majors. Let's give them some resources. The CEO has lots of leave the CEO for really important communications that the CEO should handle, investor reports, those types of things. I think that there's a more believability in somebody on the level of the audience you're trying to target. Let's say you're targeting plant managers. Do you have somebody that knows plant managers really well?
Mhm.
Has been a plant manager? Engineering. That's why Indian manufacturing works really well, because they're talking to engineers, and the person creating the content is an engineer.
Yeah.
You want the CEO to send that? No, they can't relate to that. Have them relate to somebody that wants to do this job. So I would say invest in that, and that will pay off quicker than and maybe not believable CEO level person.
Yeah, and I think in general too, anyone who sort of pays attention to hiring trends or kind of job market news knows that any employee retention levers that can be pulled in a meaningful way are going to be really beneficial because that's well, it's just very helpful for the employees and the business.
Yep.
Um, I did mention that I wanted to circle back to print products because I think maybe that's an unexpected turn in this conversation. We've
Yeah.
talked heavily about digital platforms, um, and in but print is still meaningful. I mentioned earlier newspapers are kind of disappearing, as heartbreaking as it may be, but print products is a very broad category. Could you maybe explain a bit about what excites you about print in 2024 and what businesses might want to do to think about that as an option if they haven't been?
I did a presentation a couple of months ago on the most innovative content marketing practices, and I think I started with print, and everybody was laughing. And I said, "No, I'm
Okay.
serious. Hear me out on this one." So, uh, we want to be where our competition isn't at, right? We want to have the lion's share, if you will, of attention. And where is that right now? That's in people's mailboxes. I don't know. Has anybody got mail this week? I've gotten mail every day, and when I go out, most of it's terrible. It's
Yeah.
not helpful. It's bills, it's tax stuff, it's spam flyers. Boy, what if remember the days when we used to get really amazing mail? Well, that channel is still open. Like it didn't go away. I think we're acting like, oh, nobody reads the mail anymore. Everybody does. We still get our mail. And by the way, you probably still have the mailing addresses for your customers, or you can set up an opt-in form that people can opt in. They love getting print magazines. So like a quarterly print magazine for a company, I think would be massively important. We're also seeing, I'm still surprised. Like I just launched my new book, The Content Entrepreneur, which is right there. And
Mhm.
I'm surprised. I, you always think that people are going to get the ebook. Oh, it's electronic, ebook. Well, most of the sales are from the paperback and the hardcover. there's a movement going on about people wanting to detach from their phones. They want to engage in something, whatever. So I think print books for a company, I think that's an opportunity there. I think print quarterly magazines. I was going to do one. I would say quarterly is a good cadence to choose from. And you and I were talking before, Eric, about funding these things.
Mhm.
They can be expensive depending on what you're doing, but not as expensive as you think. I think a lot of the technology has made it so that print is a little bit more affordable. There's still postage to pay, but you can also bring in partners, bring in non-competitive partners that care about whatever you're talking about for whatever your magazine is about and help you produce this jointly. And you can combine your customer lists, if you will, and make this more meaningful. So I, and if you don't believe me, uh, Amazon.com is like tripled down their budget on their print magazine in your catalog. Walmart is following
Yeah.
suit the same way. So these are big billion-dollar budgets that are saying, hey, this is important. There's an opportunity here. I think in the next 2 years, you're going to see more and more of this happen as everyone has gone digital. Not that it's bad, but it's cluttered. It is very, if you said, 10 years ago, I want to be a YouTube star, great. I can tell you exactly how to make that happen. If you said that today, I'd be like, wow, that's tough.
Yeah.
That's really tough. Same thing with podcasts. It's really tough to build an audience. It's possible. You have to do all the things we talked about, but it's much easier to get somebody's attention when you're sending them a magazine at their home or their workplace. Much easier. So
Yeah, I've got one follow-up idea there. I've got a couple more questions. Of course, the audience, please feel free to jump in with some Q&A questions there. We'll make sure to get to those as we're kind of rounding the hour here. A book or a magazine, setting aside even the finances, it might sound like a tall order, but I wanted to, I guess, make the comment that a blog post a week is a book a year, basically. And I think
yep.
maybe I'm just echoing something you've even said, that there's, you're not just publishing a piece of content and then reaping the benefits for a week and then forgetting about it. This content can be repurposed. And in fact, a blog post is just one of many possible formats. We've talked about
Yep.
a lot of formats already. Could you maybe just touch on that a little bit? Whether we're talking about the end result of the book or not, just the realization that businesses who haven't even really thought about this might be sitting on a wealth of content that can be repurposed today.
Yeah, I mean, I love the blog to book strategy. I've been using this for a long, long time. I mean,
Mhm.
Epic Content Marketing was basically 75% of blog posts that I created in the previous year. And I'm like, I got 75% of a book, and you edit it, you put it together, and now I've got a book. But if you plan this ahead of time, let's just say it was on the business, you were doing a blog on the business of cannabis and talking about all the things that are going on in that area. Okay, great. Blog post, blog post, blog post. And there's a chapter. And so you plan it that way that by the 6 months, you're like, wow, we have something here. And 9 months, you've got your book out and you self-publish it. And then you could set it out. And then, I mean, to a copy of the Content Entrepreneur published $6. It costs us $6. You could charge whatever you want, $10,
Yeah.
$15. You give it away for free. Great marketing, right? Whatever you want to do, but that's all one and the same. I mean, that's where, like, if you're going to a trade show, like, what do you want to give out? You should be giving out a book. That's the best tchotchke ever. You're leaving them with your education and information and helping them do a better job at work. I mean, those are the types of things that I think of. So yeah, and by the way, it could be a podcast. You could take podcast transcripts, YouTube transcripts, do the same. If you think about it ahead of time and plan for it and say, yes, at the end of the year, we want to be prepared to publish this book. So here's the editorial calendar. Here's how it's going to look. We'll fill in those gaps. And by the end of it, we'll edit it. We'll proofread it. Ready to go. I love
Yeah,
that.
absolutely. Looking ahead, I would be, I suppose, remiss if I didn't at least mention the NFL in passing. We kind of started this conversation talking about Pete Rose and baseball, but obviously you and your co-host Robert on the podcast are football fans. You and I are alike in the fact that we can commiserate over our Cleveland Browns fandom.
Yeah.
I wanted to bring this up, if only because um, you're not in the football business exactly, but you share a lot of football content with your audience. And at the same time, you're not in the football business, but you can glean lessons from the NFL, which is has a bajillion-dollar budget. None of us are owners of professional sports leagues, but there are lessons to be drawn from that. So this is kind of just an echo of the first question, but um, as a content creator, how do you think about that? Meaning, you could choose to just not get into football at all. It's not related exactly to what you're talking about, but why take the time to share in the joy of that topic with your co-host and with your audience, knowing that you're not selling football game tickets
Well,
necessarily?
so we have found, so Robert Rose and I have found that the more we talk about ourselves in the begin, like it's a news show, it's a marketing and content news show, but the more we talk about ourselves, the better we seem to do because people respond to like the individual quirks that we have. So we've leaned into the weirdness that is Cowboys fan for him and Browns fan. So that aside, the point that I wanted to make, so a little bit different, but I think it's important. I was doing some research because I was following the NCAA women's and how their ratings have just shot up through the roof. And on a lot of the cases on the backs of Caitlin Clark. And just a phenomenal change. And I'm like, is this changing the sport? Will more people watch NCAA women's basketball now because of this, whatever this sea change is, whatever happened? And then I went back to NFL and I wondered, and I'm reading this Pete Rose book and I'm like, okay, well, the MLB used to be the top sport in the country. And then that got overtaken in the 60s and 70s by NFL. And I'm like, why did that happen? And not that he gets the credit, but Joe Namath, Broadway Joe, got a lot of credit. And the NFL put a lot of focus on Joe Namath as a star. And so let's go back to our conversation about an opportunity for everybody listening to this. By NCAA women's focusing on Caitlin Clark, a star, and New York Jets and NFL focusing on Joe Namath, another star. What do you talk about when you're talking about the things you love? You talk about the stars that you follow, the athletes. The same thing is true for your marketing. People want to follow other people that are interesting to them. That can be your marketing strategy. So if you start with 1 or 2 or 3, I mean, when we launched Content Marketing Institute back in the day, I knew my role was to sort of be the host, the guy, get interest, wear orange all the time. Not always, yeah, do some crazy things sometimes. That was my role, to get attention. People were interested. They wanted to come sometimes to see me. That's great. I'll lean to it, work for the business. Everyone can do that type of thing. That can be part of your content marketing strategy. And that's what the NFL did way better than Major League Baseball did, leaned into its fans as it was starting to, or leaned into its celebrities and stars that was growing. I think you're going to see the same thing for women's basketball. And I think everyone on this call should look at who are my stars, my employees in my company that are just going to work every day, sitting there with no opportunity to build anything. Like your best marketing department are your employees. That's the number one thing you should, those are your assets right there. So let's figure out a way to use them. You already have those resources. Let's just take the next step with it.
I think that's a really good way of tying in a lot of what we've talked about. I feel like we could go off on an incredible tangent here about the weaknesses of the MLB's marketing over the last X amount of years, and even into this current season. But maybe that's a conversation for another day.
Yeah.
Joe, I want to thank you so much for not only your time, but certainly for sharing your expertise. These are super fun topics. They're kind of, on one hand, they're evolving every day, but there's also some very tried and true, really timeless information about content marketing and its relationship to, not to sound like I'm too much of a high horse, but its relationship to human nature, really, at the end of the day, is kind of what we're talking about. I'll remind the audience again, and I want to thank everybody for joining us today and signing up, but I'll remind you all that Content Entrepreneur Expo in just a few weeks, and May 5th through 7th in Cleveland, Ohio, is going to be an opportunity to continue this conversation. Joe will be there. I'll be there. The Encore 360 team will be on site. And I think it's going to be, I'm looking forward to it. Just a great couple of days of getting in depth here. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And Joe, once again, thanks for your time. It's a great chance to talk to you. Yeah.
Super fun. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good one, everybody.